Welcome to this LEC seminar, which was actually recorded as the keynote talk at the Lancaster Environment Centre Winter Conference in January 2022. Our speaker was Dr. Paul Young, and he presented on his paper on the Montreal Protocol, an unintentionally successful climate treaty. So I'll hand you over to our chair for the seminar, Professor Oliver Wilde.
We move to our keynote talk this meeting. I'm invited Paul Young to give us a summary of his really nice piece of work that was published earlier this year on the Montreal Protocol and a kind of unexpected climate effects. I know this work has been in gestation for a long time, but it's great to see it come together, and it's had a lot of interest. So I say a fantastic piece of work. But Paul, over to you. You tell us more about it.
Great, thanks very much, Oliver. Let me just get around to the old screen share and make sure I get the right one. Here we go. Sorry, it's thinking about it, I think, isn't it? There we go. I'm gonna move back.
That's great.
Great. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. I understand I'm keeping you from lunch, so hopefully it'll be an interesting diversion. I just want to say I think it's slightly scarier to give a talk to my colleagues than it would be to people in my field. So anyway, I hope it goes okay. So yeah, as Oliver said, this was something which got published this summer, and it was a side project, and as Oliver suggested, been a long time in gestation. I think it's about 8 years from the first email that I sent to someone to it actually being published. And really what it's about is about how the Montreal Protocol, which you may know, controlled ozone depleting substances, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. And that's why it came about. I wanted to protect the ozone layer, but at the same time, in doing so, it also had some really large benefits for the climate. Some of these were already known, and in this study, we do one which we hadn't been quantified before. So this is the paper, and these are my co-authors. So it's the Montreal Protocol protects the terrestrial carbon sink, and I really want to make sure I do acknowledge my co-authors here. So particularly Anna Harper, Chris Huntingford, and Nigel Paul, our very own Nigel Paul, at the top left there, who were really the key co-authors in helping me develop this over that very long period. I should say I brought this up with, I think initially this idea came up in my job interview for Lancaster Environment Centre when Nigel was on the panel, and I think it's probably a throwaway comment for thinking about how the work that I do, thinking about the chemicals in the atmosphere, could connect with something that Nigel is interested in as someone who's interested in UV on plants. Other co-authors there are Olaf Morgenstern, Paul Newman, Luke Oman, Sasha Madronic, and Orlando Garcia, who are all atmospheric chemists or people who are involved in running climate model simulations. Okay, so just before I get into a bit more details of this, I thought I'd just start off and just give you the punchline and tell you what it's all about. And as I said at the beginning, the Montreal Protocol was instigated to protect the ozone layer. Particularly, it was initially started to ban CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, which were chemicals which were ubiquitous as refrigerants and used in aerosol cans and things like that. And what we do in this study is we imagine a world where that Montreal Protocol never came into existence, a counterfactual world where we go into a future where CFCs continue to increase, obviously with a very negative effect on the ozone layer. So in the particular aspect we were interested in here was thinking about the importance for the ozone layer and what that means for land plants, the terrestrial biosphere. So this actually is an image, I believe, of the Crook of Loon, a painting at least, and in the best state of things, with a healthy ozone layer, we protect the surface from the sun's high energy UV, and plants do their job by taking up carbon dioxide and storing them in there, which then connects to the soil, and which I'll say about a bit more in a minute. But the aspect that we looked at was to say, well, if in this world avoided, the ozone layer would be depleted because there would be more CFCs in the atmosphere, so the ozone would be destroyed. This would mean higher amounts of UV, and the plants, as this rather dramatic image might suggest, would be pretty decimated. Plants are affected by UV, and as they get affected by UV, their capacity to absorb carbon dioxide is massively reduced, and less carbon dioxide taken up by plants through photosynthesis means more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which means more warming because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. So that's basically it. That was the, if you like, the hypothesis, I suppose. But this is really what the study was looking to investigate, to quantify how much carbon dioxide would be left in the atmosphere if we never had the Montreal Protocol. So I've given three areas to this talk. I give a bit of background information about a little bit more about the ozone layer, the CFCs, and the Montreal Protocol. And then I'll talk about the results from the study. What if things were different? What if we never had a Montreal Protocol? What would happen to the atmosphere and the environment and carbon dioxide? And then I'll finish off with the so what, and try and touch on some of the areas that we're interested in this LEC winter conference, and hopefully open it up for some comments and questions from all of you. Okay, so the first part, just to give a little bit of introductory material, a bit of LEC 101. So as I've said, why do we care about the ozone layer? Is it because it basically makes life possible? Ozone absorbs high energy UVB radiation from the sun, meaning that we're not damaging the DNA of all living things on Earth. So without the ozone layer, life would certainly not have evolved as we know it, or we'd certainly need something else there to absorb the UV. Sorry, this is a little bit of a slightly technical slide, but the ozone layer is, if we look at the image on the right first, to show how ozone is distributed in the atmosphere. So this is going up the atmosphere from the surface up to about 35 kilometers up. And this, if we look on this axis, shows you an idea of what the concentration of ozone is. So ozone is present in the troposphere, which is the region of the atmosphere where we are. But the 90% of the ozone is present in the stratosphere, in this region we call the ozone layer. Ozone near the surface, as an aside, is produced from emissions of all different kinds of reactive gases, and we care about it there actually as an ingredient in air pollution. But here we're mostly focused on stratospheric ozone. And actually, the presence of ozone in the stratosphere, because it absorbs UV light, it actually heats that bit of the atmosphere. So as we go up from the surface where we live, the temperature decreases until we hit the beginning of the ozone layer, basically. And that absorbance of UV means that the temperature, so this is what this plot on the left is showing, sorry, the temperature begins to increase. So as well as being important for UV, ozone is actually also important for climate more generally. So there's been the ozone layer and the stratosphere have really been was only even discovered in the late 1800s, that there was a stratosphere, and the ozone layer itself was discovered only shortly after that. But over the 20th century, there's a lot of work done to try and understand the chemistry of the ozone layer, how it's made, why is it there in the first place. And then lots of people started thinking about pollution and how some of the things that we emit as humans can affect the ozone layer. And so people had looked at emissions of nitrogen oxides from supersonic aircraft, which fly very high up into the atmosphere. But one of the really surprising things was how that CFCs could be a threat to the ozone layer. And again, I'm not going to go into the detail of the chemistry, but it was from this 1974 paper by Mario Molina and Sherry Rowland, both no longer with us, who really highlighted the fact that CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, could be a threat to the ozone layer. And basically they said that these CFCs, which are pretty inert, unreactive in the troposphere where we live, if they get up to the stratosphere, where there's that higher energy light from the sun, that can split the molecule and spit out a chlorine atom, and it's that chlorine atom that does all the damage to the ozone layer. Okay, so this was back in 1974, and just quickly, the world avoided, this world without the Montreal Protocol that I imagine in my study, and lots of others who've done similar things, is imagining that this paper, 1974 paper, never came into existence. So CFCs were a really amazing thing when they were invented, or at least so it was thought so. They were initially used as in fridges, and then moved on into things like aerosol propellants. And before they came into existence, fridges used you need a substance in a fridge to basically take away the heat of the refrigerant. And fridges were using things like ammonia and even sulfur dioxide, and these were pretty nasty things that if they leaked out of the back and could cause all sorts of ill effects. So these CFCs, this family of compounds, the fact that they were thought to be so inert was a fantastic thing. You know, we could use them in fridges, and if it leaked, fair enough, but it wouldn't have nearly as bad as an effect as things like ammonia or SO2. Because people then they had no idea that this chemical could cause such damage to the ozone layer. They were invented by DuPont in the 30s, and it was this chemist Thomas Midgley who was the lead developing on that. And he also, as some of you may know this story, he also came up with lead in leaded petrol. And there's a quote from Bill Bryson, which is, this guy had an instinct for the regrettable, which is pretty uncanny. It's true. So I suppose we can look at the other way that he's given us as atmospheric scientists two things to really look at and study. The other thing that was interesting about CFC, so this 1974 paper from the Molina and Rowland paper really alerted the world to the fact that CFCs might damage the ozone layer, but it wasn't thought to be anything that was going to happen very quickly. There wasn't going to thought to be anything that would be, you know, immediately catastrophic. So yes, it was bad, needed to do something about it, but the decrease that they were expecting would be very slow. And it wasn't until the mid 80s when the ozone hole over Antarctica was discovered by a group of scientists from the British Antarctic Survey, Joe Farman and others. And this was very, very surprising. You know, this was a huge amount of ozone loss. This figure on the left here is from that paper from 1985, and these are measurements that are made in springtime over Antarctica at their research station at Halley Bay. And this, if you like, is the normal background, natural amounts of ozone, and their measurements, long-term measurements that they have showed this precipitous decline in ozone, which was due to the ozone hole. And they hypothesized in this paper that it was due to CFCs, but they got the mechanism slightly wrong. And it wasn't until Susan Solomon, who was my old boss at NOAA, she led an expedition in 1986 to Antarctica and made some measurements there, which showed it's the very particular conditions over Antarctica, the very cold stratosphere up there, which lead to the formation of polar stratospheric clouds, which act as a super reaction vessel. Basically, they supercharge the chlorine that comes from CFCs, meaning that the ozone depletion there is supercharged, unlike it is anywhere else in the atmosphere. And you get something that looks a bit like this. If we look at this this blue line in this plot in the middle, here's your normal ozone layer. And if we just highlight this red line here, which is measurements taken in 2006, you can see that over Antarctica, the ozone layer is essentially eaten away to nothing due to the supercharged chemistry which is going on over there. So sorry, I realize I'm telling this particular bit of the story very quickly, but I'm happy to answer any questions if you're interested, or point you to some other resources. So it was the Antarctic ozone hole the discovery of that was, in a way, really gave the international community an impetus to do something about CFCs. So it was realized that they needed to protect the ozone layer. It was realized that CFCs were damaging to the ozone layer from that 1974 paper. But it was arguably this discovery of the Antarctic ozone hole, which was sort of the oh wow moment, and led them to accelerate the phasing out of CFCs and other ozone depleting chemicals. So this figure on the right here shows a trajectory of EESCs. Basically, you can think about this as a proxy for the amount of CFCs or damaging ozone depleting substances in the stratosphere. And this black line was the trajectory that we were on, with CFCs increasing because of their brilliance, their inertness, and the many different uses that they had. And in 1987, the Montreal Protocol was signed, and this actually, in its first instance, all it did was slow down this the increase, or at least that's what would have happened had we not had subsequent amendments to the protocol which strengthened it and phased out CFCs and some other chemicals more quickly. So we'll come back to this point a little bit later, but this is why some people sort of look to this thinking about climate change more broadly. We can come up with an initial treaty which starts to do something about it, and then strengthen it with subsequent amendments. And I'm sure lots of people have got lots of interesting things that they would or thoughts about that. Okay. So let's just move on to just describe the study that we published last summer. And so what we did here is we imagined a world without the Montreal Protocol, what we call the world avoided. So the Montreal Protocol has come into existence. CFCs, in the world that we are now, the world then which will be the world expected going forward into the future. CFCs are being controlled. The ozone layer is beginning to recover. But in the world avoided, those CFCs basically follow that black line that I had on the graph 2 slides ago, and you get a very, very high concentration of chlorine up in the stratosphere, which then leads to massive destruction of ozone. And as I said, the way that we build that scenario, or the kind of the storyline to this counterfactual, is imagining that paper from Molina and Rowland in 1974 was never ever published, and so the world was not alerted to the dangers of CFCs for the ozone layer. So these figures here just show that, like, with that projected exponential increase in CFCs, you've had a massive increase of chlorine in the stratosphere by the 2060s, which is more than order of magnitude higher than we expect, due to the fact that we have the Montreal Protocol. So people have looked at this so-called world avoided before, and looked at various aspects of what might have happened, and the way that it's framed is that you run you do a computer simulation of the world expected, where the Montreal Protocol comes into existence, and you compare that to the world avoided, and just subtract one from the other and look at the difference to tell you what the impact of the Montreal Protocol is. So the only difference between the simulations is the additional CFCs. So if we start down here, with those very high levels of chlorine, we know that the amounts of UV would massively increase at the surface, and then that would have implications for skin cancers. It would also have implications for cataracts and various other human health conditions. You can also imagine that the ozone holes themselves would be a lot worse in that world. Again, I'm not going to go into detail of this, And also people have looked at climate change as well. So CFCs, as well as destroying ozone, they actually are greenhouse gases. In fact, very, very potent greenhouse gases. So if CFCs have been allowed to increase as well as destroying the ozone layer, we know that they themselves would have increased global warming. So even before we would get to this question that we went to about thinking about how the additional UV would affect plants and affect carbon dioxide that way, we know that the Montreal Protocol has had a climate effect. So yeah, so all of these studies that people have done, that looking at human health and looking at some chemical and physical aspects in the atmosphere, no one had yet addressed the question of like, well, what would have happened to plants and what would that then mean for the carbon cycle? Nigel, I know, is on this call as well, so he will be able to field any really detailed questions about this. But we know from a whole host of studies over the years that plants are indeed affected by UV, and one of the main effects when you expose them to high UV is that their growth is stunted. Okay, so their effect, you can think of that, or one way of rationalizing that is that their ability to take in carbon from the atmosphere is reduced, so they accrue less biomass and are stunted and are shorter. And so people have looked at that and demonstrated this for species where in the field, in particular for species that have been exposed to high UV, so around Antarctica and in the southern hemisphere where there have been where we have seen the big ozone depletions with the ozone hole. So as I've been saying, if UV affects plants, then that connects ozone to the carbon cycle. Okay, so this is just a little cartoon of the carbon cycle here, and again, just to kind of restate the hypothesis, really, what we were interested in this study is we thought, okay, so if we increase UV, then we're going to impact photosynthesis, which means that plants will take up less CO2 from the atmosphere. So the amount of carbon that's stored in plants will decrease. In turn, this means that less carbon is stored in the soil. So as plants die, some of that carbon gets returned to the atmosphere by either by microbes or by animals eating it and essentially reproducing the CO2. But some of it goes down into soils where it's stored for a bit longer. So if we decrease ozone, we increase UV, this decreases, carbon in plants decreases, and this decreases, which overall means that we've got more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because we've reduced this sink. I don't want to spend too long on the technical details from this, but this is a schematic for how we went about answering the question in terms of all of the different modeling systems that we use. So this was all done in silico, basically, so in computers, and very, very briefly, we had to glue together a climate model, which gives us ozone concentrations for you feed in CFCs and you feed in greenhouse gases and various things, and that climate model will spit out ozone concentrations. It will also spit out meteorology, and then we then do some post-processing of that to say, okay, well, what's the amount of UV at the surface for the amount of ozone that we've got? And then we feed that into a complicated land surface model, which simulates the carbon cycle, like I showed on the previous slide. And then we can then say, okay, once we've done all that, what does that then mean for the amount of carbon dioxide that's up in the atmosphere? And then what does that then mean for temperature? And just to restate, so what we did with this modeling framework, we ran more than two simulations, but basically there are two sets of simulations. One is a world, what we call the world expected, so where greenhouse gases continue to increase because that's the kind of trajectory that we're on. But the Montreal Protocol comes into existence and the ozone layer recovers. And then another simulation which is identical to that first one, except that CFCs continue to increase and ozone decreases. Okay, and then it's the difference between the two, which gives us the impact of the Montreal Protocol. Again, just a little bit of technical detail. So what we needed to do is to be able to translate what's the magnitude of the impact of a change in UV on plants, and this is kind of classic for scaling up everything to a global scale. There's not a lot of information out there, and you have to just do the best that you can by pulling together all the different analyses where people have looked at like the change in the amount of plant biomass for a change in UV, and we based a lot of our work of this analysis here, which essentially showed that if we increase UV by 10%, we get a 3% reduction in the amount of above ground biomass, which we then translated in our model framework as a 3% reduction in photosynthesis. So again, this is sort of technical detail. Don't worry too much about it, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end, but you can just kind of think of us as cranking through a whole load of numbers through a computer, doing the best we can with the information that we've got, and exploring a lot of the uncertainty. It doesn't quite look like this, but that was the best I could do. Well, it's a more interesting image than just a picture of me sat at a computer. Okay, just say a bit about what results do we get from here? What does the environment look like in the world avoided that we simulate? So this is a figure that they've taken from the paper, and what I want you to do here is compare the blue line, which is our world expected. I've called here world projected. I'm sorry. So, and this is ozone. So in the world, this is like the world that we live in and the world that we will live in the future. Ozone decreases in this world because CFCs did come into existence, but because of the Montreal Protocol, the ozone layer starts to recover. In the world avoided, the continued increase in CFCs takes ozone down to very, very low levels. And this is globally averaged ozone. And by the middle of the century, globally averaged, the amount of ozone is in the range of what we see over Antarctica in the ozone hole. So very, very, very depleted. This then has knock-on implications for the amount of ultraviolet radiation which reaches the surface. So this is what this shows here. Again, we're looking at time going over the 21st century, and blue line, you know, it goes up a little bit. You have to like squint to kind of see that, and then it goes down again because of the Montreal Protocol. But again, look at this orange line. We have massive increase, factor of 4 increase in the amount of UV reaching the surface. Again, these are all globally average numbers. And yeah, even before we account for this extra CO2 in the atmosphere, which I'll get to, remember that I said CFCs are also greenhouse gases. So this means that the surface temperature in our simulations, in our world avoided, is already higher than our world projected, our world expected, this blue line. So the difference between these two lines here is just due to the greenhouse effect of CFCs, adding about 1.6, 1.7 extra degrees of global warming. We can look at that a little bit more spatially, and these are a series of maps showing what the impact would be of that additional UV in the world avoided on photosynthesis, on more correctly actually carbon assimilation for different locations, looking at the 2030s, 2050s, 2070s, and 2090s. And the deeper the purple the color, the more the effect on photosynthesis. And what you see here is that earlier on in our simulated 21st century, the effects are largest in the northern mid latitudes or higher latitudes. That's because that's where the ozone depletion really kicks in first. But by the 2070s and even definitely by the 2090s, you're getting a really large impact across the tropics too. You're getting reductions in the plant's ability to absorb carbon, basically of over 50%. Compared to what it would be in our world expected. So sorry, just catching up a bit with my notes. So what this means, we can look at this in terms of a time series plot of this is the total amount of carbon which is absorbed by plants going over the 21st century. And again, the blue line is our world expected. And here, what you see is actually the amount of carbon stored by plants increases over this time because we're increasing CO2 in the atmosphere, and plants, it's one of the feedbacks in the carbon cycle, the carbon climate system, that plants will absorb more of that CO2. So in fact, we actually see photosynthesis, if you like, increase over the century. But you know, your eye is immediately drawn to this. This is our world avoided, and it just falls off a cliff. It really is bad news for the amount of land carbon if we never had a Montreal Protocol. So if we concentrate just on this solid line here, compared to our world expected, our world avoided is about 90% less photosynthesis. So 90% less carbon is absorbed by land plants. Again, I'm not going to go too much into detail here, but this shading around here and this line here are sensitivity studies where we both slightly increased and reduced and drastically reduced the strength of the UV impact on plants. In fact, just very quickly, this thin line here assumes that the plants aren't really actually that sensitive to UV at all. It's 90% less potent an effect than we have in our base case. But because there's such a huge depletion of ozone, we still see a massive effect. Again, maybe I can talk about that in the questions afterwards. Okay, so with a huge reduction in the carbon uptake by plants, that then translate to much less carbon being stored in the soils. So these are really big numbers. The soil is a really important store of carbon. It's Jess Davies on this call will be able to tell you better than me. But you see in our world avoided, again, looking at the difference between this orange and the blue line, it falls off about 30%. The 30% less carbon by the end of the century in our world avoided, stored in the soils. Then, as I've hinted at before, if we've got less carbon stored in plants, we've got less carbon stored in the soil, ultimately that's going to mean there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So again, if we look at the difference between these orange and blue lines, we get about 30% more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in a world without the Montreal Protocol compared to our world expected. And again, this shows the range of our from our sensitivity studies, but they all show an increase in carbon dioxide. Oh, is it nearly time, isn't it? This is very, and then this translates into very bad news for climate. Extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere means we get additional warming. So what we can do, we can look to the Montreal Protocol as and look at its its climate impact, and we can split that into two and show that some of its impact has come from protecting, reducing CFCs because they're greenhouse gases. But then what we newly quantified here is that this reduction in carbon dioxide because of these feedbacks with the terrestrial biosphere. So CFCs is greenhouse gases. That means it avoided about 1.7 degrees of warming, and then we've got additional 0.8 degrees of warming that come from the CO2 effect. Very, very quickly, I just want to show just 3 examples of where we might go next with this. Well, one is that the UV Earth system is really complicated, and there are lots of different ways that UV can impact land system processes. So this from a very technical Earth system point of view, and it really is completely underexplored. So that's something that is definitely of interest. But perhaps more broadly, I think that people want to think about what are there lessons from the Montreal Protocol for climate. This is taken from shown from a blog post that I wrote with a political scientist based on this study. who very quickly talked about how that we might think that the climate is more complicated. It is, but there definitely are lessons that we can take from Montreal Protocol, and perhaps I can talk about that in the questions. And lastly, I think thinking more broadly, there is a value in thinking about how the future could be different. And one of the reasons for that is, with my colleagues in the Institute for Social Futures talk about this, is this idea of giving policymakers a literacy of timescales to show that their decisions they make today will have consequences going well out into the future. Okay, I do apologize for going over time. I will leave up these closing remarks very quickly and let you have a look at them. I will again emphasize point 4. It was very nice to be able to do this slowly, although perhaps it was a little bit, 8 years is perhaps a little bit too slow from email to publication. Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Paul, for a great presentation, and for a very nice piece of work. And I mean, it really demonstrates the power of bringing together understanding from different parts of the Earth system, and you know, we can learn so much more by putting these bits together. The kind of interdisciplinary aspect of it is really great. You've got some questions and comments quite a lot in the chat.
So Crispin's comment was frightening. It wasn't Montreal Protocol skin cancers, cataracts through the roof. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's certainly. I got asked a lot about, like, from journalists about this. You know, what can you paint a picture of what that of what this world avoided might have looked like? And I think, you know, one of the ones we'd probably be living underground, and if you go outside for 5 minutes a day, caked in sun cream, wearing a hat, and you know, all bits of your skin covered up. It's really yeah, I think it really is catastrophic. You know, it's the stuff of sci-fi. Luckily. Sorry, Oliver, I don't want to be taking your job. Is it all right? Shall I just do this?
Please do.
Elizabeth asked, does model account for the impacts of warming and temperature fluctuations on plant photosynthesis? I have to, yeah, there's some of this technical detail. And I wanted to actually acknowledge Elizabeth's talk. Obviously, Elizabeth was talking to a lot more about some of the process detail, about how photosynthesis works, which it'd be interesting to catch up with them and people are interested in this afterwards. But yes, the model does capture, like, these large scale temperature and precipitation effects, as well as this UV. David also has to run years of persistence to get there. Compelling story of how we already dodged key elements of a climate catastrophe. So a really big shot of hopefulness, because why can't we do it again? Yeah, and I think this was really the tone of lots of the questions that I got asked when this got published. As you can imagine, so I got lucky, I think, with the timing of this paper in terms of the interest that it created, because it came out just after the IPCC report had come out, and which was, you know, it's unrelenting bad news. And I think people looked on this to say, like, as a story of hope, you know, that we have done something before. And I think I do agree with that. I do agree with David's point of, you know, that it is compelling. We have done something before. You could also maybe look to acid rain, and I know colleagues on here would be able to give other examples of how we have been able to do things before. You know, at the same time, though, these are potentially more tractable problems. So my sort of stock answer to this was, you know, the Montreal Protocol was dealing with a set of chemicals produced by a handful of companies that had a handful of uses, of which there were replacements already available. So unlike CO2, which essentially permeates every part of our existence. But nevertheless, I think what I did learn from, and actually this was the guy I wrote the blog post with, is because he was approached by a journalist, and I read the article, thought, oh, you've made some really interesting points that I hadn't really thought about. So, you know, he's a political scientist who thinks about international relations, and yeah, I think that there are some definitely technical wonkish elements of the Montreal Protocol system that really could be used and could be successful in applying to both the climate change problem, and no doubt a host of other things too. But I'm very sure that people on the school will be far more expert than me. Do you worry about the work we'll give countries that cut the most CFCs for doing less to cut carbon? I don't know. So this is a question from Duncan McLaren. Sorry, I'll repeat that. So given the political momentum behind carbon trading, do you worry that your work will give the countries that cut most CFCs arguments for doing less to cut carbon? Yeah, I think, well, Duncan, you're probably much better posed to answer that question than me. I think you see CFCs have basically been cut to zero in most places by now. I think that they're only allowed in a handful of exceptional uses, mostly related to medical uses. Well, they haven't found a suitable replacement yet. There are still banks of CFCs in fridges and things like that, which have to be disposed and dealt with properly. I think one of the issues that is interesting is that HFCs, which are the third generation replacement for CFCs, don't deplete ozone, but they are very strong greenhouse gases, and they are now being phased out by the latest amendment to the Montreal Protocol. But I have been having conversations with people who are worried that is the actually companies rather than countries are looking to slow down that phase out. I don't know, Duncan. It'd be great to pick up to think about some of what this means politically with you for sure. So sorry, I haven't really answered your question, but perhaps given a little bit more context. And sorry, I've talked a lot, and it's gone one.
No, that's great, Paul. That's some fantastic pieces of work and lots of opportunities for further research and links, both within the sciences and social sciences. Lots of thumbs up, lots of very positive comments there. I say it's a really nice study, and I hope we can learn a lot more from it. So thanks very much indeed for giving our keynote there and for presenting that. And yeah, good luck taking it further.
Thanks very much to Professor Oliver Wild for chairing and for Dr. Paul Young for speaking at today's LEC seminar, and for everyone that participated in the whole of our winter conference this year. Our next LEC seminar will be coming up on the 26th of January, at which Dr. Germain Baldi will be presenting geographical patterns of protected areas in an uneven world. So we hope you'll join us for that. In the meantime, thank you very much, and have a good day.